so much for coming, both to our in-person audience and online attendees. We're very pleased to welcome you to this evening's knowledge session on contracts for climate. Some quick housekeeping. For those in person, please remain in this room and the corridors. The bathrooms are found out to your right, and the main office is out of bounds for reasons of client confidentiality. Yes, please do. All latecomers welcome. Sorry. And for the online audience, please do keep your camera and microphone off until the breakout rooms later on. So I'm Matilda Graham. I'm a founding member of Legal Voices for the Future and a trainee solicitor here at Bates Wells. I'm currently completing my final seat in the Impact Economy team, and I'm due to qualify in August into dispute resolution. Before joining Bates Wells, I spent a year working as a project associate at the Chancery Lane project, which is where I discovered a passion for this evening's topic. And for those of you who don't know, the Chancery Lane project, or TCLP as it's often shortened to, is a global pro bono initiative focused on using contract law to enable a rapid and just transition to a net zero economy. Broadly, they draft climate clauses and supporting materials to explain them and guide practitioners how to implement them. In many ways, it was quite a strange way to start my legal career. It felt almost topsy-turvy. Many, if not most of my colleagues had left big law because they had become frustrated with the traditional hierarchical systems and wanted to break free from those. They had found it difficult to stay true to their personal belief systems, particularly in respect of climate change whilst working at law firms. I was repeatedly warned how grueling a training contract could be and asked about how soon I'd be hatching my exit plan. Well, I'm pleased to say that I haven't had that experience, far from it, but I do think I was given a gift working at TCLP at the very start of my legal career. The gift of perspectives sometimes too rarely found in the field of law. Being able to question doing things a certain way just because it's the way that things have always been done, knowing the value of collaboration to facilitate imaginative solutions, and most importantly, belief in the power of junior lawyers to champion change. And the last of those, of course, being the foundational concept of Legal Voices for the Future. With that in mind, let's look at the structure for today's session. So as those of you who've joined us before will know, our sessions are in three parts. It starts with a brief presentation on the topic at hand, followed by an interview. And tonight we're very lucky to be joined by Phoebe Roberts. We'll take a short comfort break at 8 o'clock, and then we'll reconvene promptly for a discussion on the creative content selected for this evening. And just to quickly say that we do occasionally experience a drop off in attendance at the interval, as it were, and I cannot emphasize enough that we do encourage you to stay for the full session. I appreciate that it's a long session and a fairly late night on a school night. However, our attendees consistently feedback the most excitement about those parts of the event. It's a chance to meet each other and connect with like-minded junior lawyers, as well as to use your brain in a very different way from the day job. And we find that thinking creatively is so important in this sphere to enhance our ability to think imaginatively about climate solutions, as well as to process the complicated emotions that often accompany navigating this sphere. What's more, this evening's creative content is a 5-minute short film, which I'll play before the discussion. So if any of you haven't managed to do your homework, not to worry. Which brings us to why contracts? Well, to put it into context, in April 2023, the Law Society of England and Wales introduced their seminal guidance, The Impact of Climate Change on Solicitors. This guidance covers a wide range of issues, including science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions for both law firm and client alike, climate risk disclosure frameworks, advised emissions, that's calculating the emissions associated with the matters upon which lawyers advise, and greenwashing. The guidance clearly states that the expanding scope of climate legal risks may impact our professional duties to our clients. So I think it's worth highlighting the point that the Law Society of England and Wales have now advised that solicitors need to recognise where the impacts of climate change may affect their practice and or their clients. In other words, this isn't something you need to be concerned with only if you're an environmental lawyer or a climate litigator. This is now the concern of all lawyers, as stated by our professional association. And what are the bread and butter of all lawyers, if not contracts? Contracts are the building blocks of all economic activity and therefore a powerful nexus for change. What's more, the doctrine of freedom of contract means that you or I could broadly put whatever we wanted in a contract tomorrow. Which brings me to my next slide, comparing the three major ways of affecting legal change. So we have legislation, litigation, and contracts. And let me caveat this by saying I think that all three are essential levers to change. However, powerful though they may be, regulation and litigation can unfortunately be incredibly and onerously slow. It can take years to push through a new law or challenge big corporates in court, and we simply don't have the time to rely solely on these methods. Amending contracts is comparatively quick. It also has the added benefit of being collaborative rather than competitive. It's based on voluntary agreement and being potentially extraterritorial in effect. As lawyers, we use contracts every day to enshrine profit margins, set up value, set up services or goods specifications. What if, as well as using contracts to achieve those goals, we also use them to achieve our science-based targets to reduce emissions? Put simply, with contracts, we can quickly and effectively turn climate goals into legal obligation and action. So what does greening contracts look like? Well, I'd like to start with a framework to analyse contract clauses, and that's the Chancery Lane Project's Net Zero Dashboard. Broadly, climate clauses seek to reduce emissions in line with net zero targets, but within that there is considerable nuance. As you can see from left to right, the metrics represent a spectrum of increasing ambition. For example, does the clause in question seek to reduce Scope 1 emissions only, or does it include Scope 2 and 3 or beyond? Does it support post-2050 without interim targets, or does it achieve change well before 2050 with clear and actionable interim targets? So you'll notice that best-in-class clauses would also consider the extent to which offsetting is relied upon, which ideally would only be used as a last resort, and even then, only with a verifiable source that guarantees additionality. Involve board engagement and impact assessments on transitional equity. That being said, the most ambitious clause is not going to be appropriate in every context, so you need to take a proportionate approach based on the size and resources of the parties as well as their value alignment. And moving on to this, which is again a Chancery Lane Project resource, and sorry, for those of you in the room, I might try and minimize that so you can see it a bit better. Use my high tech. There we go. So here you can see a snapshot overview of the Chancery Lane Project, some of the Chancery Lane Project's precedent clauses. So if your client has set net zero or greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, but isn't clear how to get there, implementing these clauses across the contractual life cycle will assist them. On the flip side, if the client's contract as currently stands may be blocking their efforts to decarbonise, so if decarbonisation is out of scope, i.e. not priced, or if the solution in a services contract requires a level of carbon emission to function, then you cannot change emissions without changing the terms. So this map shows many intervention points to overcome such obstacles. And as you can see, they span from pre-contract phase all the way through to procurement, performance, to breach and dispute resolution. At the far left of the contractual timeline, corporate lawyers may be interested in the Paris compliant company objects, climate change aligned board minutes, or green shareholders agreements. These set the tone or agree mutual objectives and value alignment from the outset. Along the way, there are precedent clauses for green financing, insurance, due diligence, and climate aligned heads of terms. And at the end of the timeline, there's a precedent drafting for consequences for breach. For example, there's a green liquidated damages clause that requires donations to climate NGOs for breach of climate clauses. So let's look at one example of a clause in more detail. So here we have the net zero standard for suppliers. I haven't put the whole clause on screen because it's too long to include, but I will circulate it afterwards. And I've chosen an example that I thought would be most cross-applicable and accessible to all practice areas and level of knowledge. So what's this clause about? Well, the average company supply chain emissions are estimated to be 5.5 times greater than those generated by their direct operations. And so there's a growing momentum from the business community to commit to net zero targets, such as by signing up to the UNFCCC's Race to Zero. But the majority of finding scope 3 emissions, that's indirect emissions or those associated with supply chains, the most difficult to measure and reduce due to a lack of data and transparency. Climate risk also affects critical supply chain issues of cost, speed and responsiveness, quality, and the uncertainty of disruption. So this drafting can be annexed to any supply agreement to cascade greenhouse gas reporting and reduction obligations throughout the supply chain to enable parties to meet their net zero targets and reduce emissions. And this clause makes supply contracts a vehicle to achieve this by creating mechanisms to set, measure and verify binding emissions commitments, cascading emissions reductions through supply chains, thus increasing participation in greenhouse gas reductions, and ensuring climate change is a central issue across all companies' agendas by incentivizing greener suppliers. In case you think this idea is purely academic, let's look at some case studies of corporates who have used this drafting in practice. So you might have heard of some of these. They're not niche environmental organizations, as you can see. Vodafone have publicly put climate clauses in their supply chain processes. And interestingly, they've created high and low emitting supplier templates to accommodate SMEs. So to accommodate what we're talking about, that the most onerous obligations aren't going to be appropriate in every context. At Salesforce set a target that they wanted 60% of their suppliers to have signed up to their ambitious science-based reductions targets by 2024. So this was a couple of years ago that they first did this. And their contracts also require suppliers to develop and implement a plan of continuous improvement in terms of reducing carbon footprint, to deliver their products or services in a carbon neutral basis by offsetting their emissions resulting from the provision of goods or services, and to publicly disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And finally, NatWest require suppliers to improve their sustainability score, with failure to improve allowing NatWest to terminate the contract. So I hope you found this topic as motivating as I have, because it offers a clear-cut way for all of us to start implementing positive change in our daily work immediately. So I encourage you after this session to explore the Chancery Lane project and their website. I'll also share my speaker notes, slides and links to the key resources discussed. I appreciate that, you know, looking at a clause is not something we traditionally do together in a group, in a room. So I'm sure the lawyers will appreciate being sent the clause afterwards to have a look at. And at TCLP, we saw time and time again that it was the trainees or the NQs that would push this cause within their organisation. It's a way that junior lawyers can make a name for themselves and impress with their initiative. TCLP also have comms resources for this purpose. They have a trainee solicitor starter pack and a template memorandum which you can customise and share with relevant contacts at your organisation. So in this way, you can start to consider what good you can do in the world with every single transaction you work on and bridge the gap between broadening ambition and effective change. So we have explored the theory of climate clauses, but I wanted to dedicate most of the time for this evening using the interview section to explore the theory in practice. And to that end, I'm delighted to welcome Phoebe Roberts. Thank you for joining us. Phoebe is the Director of Implementation at the Chancery Lane Project, and she's also a Senior Associate at Mint Ellison's Climate Risk Governance team. Phoebe, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Matilda.
So as you know, you're speaking to an audience of mostly junior lawyers or law students, and a lot of them are navigating how to align their values with their career. Can you tell us a bit more about your professional trajectory and how you've come from a more traditional legal background to centering your career around climate and sustainability?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you and to be in the room with you, and hello to everyone online, lots of you there. So perhaps I should start off by saying that I'm Australian and I'm based in Melbourne, so hence the accent, and that I do my role with the Chancery Lane Project remotely. So perhaps just as well as a bit of a framing. So I'm neither an environmental lawyer, nor am I an environmental litigator or climate litigator. I and the team that I work in, along with Isabel here at Minter Ellison, look at climate and sustainability risks more broadly, so including nature and biodiversity and other sustainability risks through a financial and liability risk lens. So for our clients, thinking rather than looking at climate change as an ethical issue or the right thing to do, which is what most of us in this room look at climate change as, rather as what does it mean for their bottom line and how does existing corporate laws require them to implement initiatives and make changes within their corporate structures, decision-making structures within their organisation to ensure that they're not exposing themselves to undue liabilities. So through that lens, my background is in construction and infrastructure, and towards the end of 2019, I heard a presentation at a roundtable it was a client roundtable situation from my now boss and the partner in our team, Sarah Barker, about the financial and liability risks associated with climate change for the property sector and what that meant for property clients. And in that session, acknowledging I'm very late to the party on climate change, being the end of 2019, Sarah explained to us not only what these financial consequences were, but what the projected temperature increases when it's going to be by the middle of the century, the billions of people that are going to be without access to fresh water, 50% species decline by the middle of the century. All of that stuff just sort of hit me like a ton of bricks. And I went back to my desk and never looked at the way that I practiced law again, in particular at that time as a construction lawyer, working on major projects. I was working on, train lines that had 25-year asset lives and drafting contracts, thinking no one has thought about climate. Why has no one thought about climate change? I've just learned from Sarah, this is the biggest foreseeable risk that any of our clients are going to face. And we know that it's coming. We have the science, yet none of us are talking about it. And this is going to materially change how things are priced in this contract, every obligation under this contract. And so from that point, I just started thinking about how does climate impact on a whole host of obligations, and really became that sort of, I hate to say it, but that like kooky climate lady in the team, which some of you might identify as being that person as well in your team, that I couldn't stop thinking about putting climate into every situation that nothing made sense to me. In law and outside of law as well. I just really uprooted my life in that way. And that was when I was introduced at the end of 2019 to the Chancery Lane project, when it first started to kick off. And it gave me an avenue to sort of put my energy in how the hell are we going to make sense of this traditional risk allocation. As Matilda has said, people have been doing this for years and years. Most experienced practitioners agreeing the same indemnity clauses, the same delay events, never reassessing, weather events and how that might impact on, that's a really plain example, how that would impact on project delivery. And that's, TCLP was born at the end of mid to end of 2019. I got involved with peer reviewing the clauses and then started drafting clauses to go into the playbook of clauses, particularly in the construction context. And at that point in time, I was a construction lawyer. I was actually working part-time at Minter Ellison as a senior associate, doing a master's in coaching psychology, because I was like, I'm out of law. This is not for me anymore. And actually what I want to do is help associates and junior level senior associates work out how they can get the best out of their careers, because I felt like myself, you've got this amazing group of ambitious, hardworking, the smartest people in the room, and then they get 4 years into their career and they look out and they think, what the hell am I doing here? And then little did I know that I would find my purpose, and then that would be the reason, but spent a lot of money on a master's degree to work that one out. And so, yeah, I just continued to, I just couldn't stop thinking about it really. And so I started to get involved with Sarah at that point in time, started doing presentations internally, and without realising, creating a profile for myself as the go-to person for climate sustainability matters, particularly on a contracting sense, which was completely novel at that point in time. And 2 and a bit years ago, I transferred into Sarah's team, which to work on climate sustainability risk matters, sort of in a fulsome sense, without having to then upkeep my traditional construction practice, which was getting difficult for me at that point in time because I just really wanted to focus on sustainability matters. I was lucky at Minters to be supported to, once I'd finished my master's, transfer to doing my 2 days a week with the Transfer Lane project as a sort of semi-secondment to then take on my role as the Director of Implementation and also lead the built environment workstream in the UK and EU, which is an interesting job to do from Australia, I'll just say. But what I'm really focused on, and particularly can talk a little bit more about this, is that TCLP has the solutions. We all understand, and depending on what area of law you're in, particularly lawyers, know contracts in and out, and they understand the commercial pressures of their clients. We really all now need to focus on actually getting these clauses into documents rather than feeling warm and fuzzy about drafting more ideas. So that's where I really focus on the implementation side and how do we support corporates, how do we support lawyers on actually using these clauses rather than just talking about them.
Thank you. That's so amazing to hear you speak. Yeah, let me find
quite hard.
Have you got one? Yeah. I knew you were going to be a brilliant person to speak to this audience for that reason. It's so great to hear so many of the things you're saying are very relatable despite your sometimes superhuman qualities. So you were mentioning you came on at the end there to your role as Director of Implementation. Can you give us your elevator pitch for why organisations should be using these clauses in their contract?
Sure, you did a very good job, Matilda. But I think for organisations that have Scope 3 targets and just emissions reduction targets, how else are you implementing your targets if not through contracts, and in particular those Scope 3 emissions? So there is emissions outside of your business fence line. So if you're not using a contract with counterparties, how else? And like that is actually a question to the room. How else are you meant to influence emissions reduction for parties that aren't within your business? And often the only relationship that you have with them, apart from the one when you pick up the phone and talk to them, is through your contractual arrangement. So they're really important, particularly now with the focus on greenwashing and implementation of emissions reductions targets, which is a real square focus of both regulators and activist litigants. If you're acting for corporates, if they're stating that they have targets, how else are they robustly implementing them and demonstrating that they are implementing those targets if it's not cascaded through all of your corporate arrangements? And then on the flip side, for organisations who don't have emissions targets, obviously a bit of a harder conversation, but for those corporates, it's really about creating flexibility and being agile in a context, managing risk, really managing downside risk in an environment where there are economic transition risks that are constantly shifting. So do you have the mechanisms in place to reduce emissions down the track once there are mandatory obligations in place? Are you locking yourself into a really high emitting scenario that you then can't get out of? And then once you do set targets or once there are mandatory requirements, how are you going to be meeting those targets? I think as well, the efforts of sort of global reporting and disclosure requirements, the ISSB, what you guys have over here as well in relation to mandatory TCFD reporting, and we're hopefully getting something similar in Australia sometime soon. But and even not even mandatory, but just the expectations of shareholders and investors in relation to corporate disclosure, even if you don't have Scope 3 targets, the informational requirements for investors is just going up and up and up and up. And if you're not using your contracts to gather that information, it's going to be near impossible for you to report on that information. long elevator. We were going up the ground to 1150 and back down. But
No, that was great. Thank you. And related question, but a distinct one. What do you say to lawyers about why they need to be advising their clients about this?
Yeah.
material?
This one I think is easier actually, because and this was I think the point that got me, was that our job as lawyers is to protect our clients from risk and to mitigate those risks on their behalf, particularly transactional lawyers. That's what we do. And through contracts, we allocate risk and commercial risks, help our clients make commercial decisions and weigh that up and document it in a contract. And as I said earlier, if you're not considering the most foreseeable, largest and foreseeable risk to your clients, how are you properly advising them? And that, just as you would for cyber risk or just traditional environmental compliance risk, I think it's often ESG issues are often sort of bucketed into compliance issues, which they're fundamentally not. As you've described, regulation is a really lag indicator of where risks are. And just as I talked about earlier, for disclosure, for example, mandatory disclosure and what is expected of investors is a very different story. And so if you're looking to compliance issues to advise on climate and waiting for regulation, you're not properly advising your clients of risk. And so particularly for transition risk, I mean, the TCLP clauses don't really deal with the physical risks of climate change, which is a big area that we need to think about, but they really squarely deal with the transitional risks. So the economic shifts that we're going to feel on the pathway to net zero and how we navigate those. And it's like that guidance in the Law Society is significantly influential outside of the UK. Let me just say that, which, here, even in Australia, looking outwards, it's influencing how particularly large law firms are thinking about how they need to sort of filter it across teams. It's not just reliant on the climate environmental teams to be advising on these matters, but rather every lawyer needs to be a climate lawyer.
Yeah, that's great. I really encourage anyone who hasn't had a look at that guidance to have a look at it, and I'll circulate that as well. I'm just going to check. There's a couple of comments. I just want to check we're not muted or anything.
Question.
Oh, great. Okay, we'll come to that later. So when we first started working together in this area, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I think we had some lawyers who would come to our hackathons or sessions and be like, this is all great in theory, but, ultimately this goes beyond our professional remit, and we have to wait for our client to ask for this. Have you seen a change in those last 2 and 3 years in the demand and appetite for this sort of
crazy amounts?
Yeah.
Crazy. It's really, so I think even today, Leonie, a colleague from Chancery Lane Project, is in the front row here, future trainee at Bates Wells. We had a session today that Leonie was running with a group of multinational corporates, some of the biggest organisations in the world, if you can think of them. They were probably in the room today, about how not if they should be implementing climate clauses, and not even how they're going about implementing climate clauses, but really niche conversation about particular elements of Scope 3 information reporting and gathering, which I think demonstrates how far things have shifted, Matilda, since we were doing how to use climate clauses and what is a climate clause sessions with groups of lawyers and corporates compared to where we're at now with this stuff. I think personally, a few years ago, even sort of a year and a half ago, I was very much the one who was always trying to get the clauses into matters and raising them with partners and doing presentations, and everyone was just like, shut the fuck up about the climate clauses, woman, nobody wants them type thing. And now I'm like at least twice a week, I would say, contacted by partners or lawyers within the firm asking how to help them with drafting from a whole range of practice areas. And not only that, but attracting clients and work because of our particular expertise in this area, particularly in Australia, where we are, you know, because of our early involvement with TCLP, they have been thinking about this for quite a while. The tables have really turned. I'm no longer the one trying to get the message out, but rather people are grappling with actually how complex this can be, and how, particularly once, you know, it seems teams often try to draft these clauses on their own and then realise it's a little bit more complicated. And also the stakes are a lot higher now, given greenwashing reporting requirements and understanding how to translate clients' targets into their contracts. So it's changed so much. It's changed so much, and that's where, like, I think for this generation that I would like to defend, I'm a part of, but not anymore. It's just such a more fertile ground for having these conversations, that when I first started looking at this, and it wasn't even that long ago, 4 years ago, the conversation was still, how do we get people to consider climate change, and really having to frame it through this financial liability risk lens. And that was really, we felt, was not the only way, but the core way of getting corporates in particular to listen about climate and why they needed to act. That why question is not there anymore, particularly for large organisations. Smaller organisations might need a little bit more sort of hand-holding, but for large corporates, it's squarely on the agenda, and it's seen as a key commercial part of the discussion, rather than this like nice to have. I mean, just looking at job vacancies in the ESG and climate area in corporates just tells you the capacity gap for a lot of organisations in how they implement this, but also where resources and energy is being thrown in this stuff.
Brilliant. Well, that's reassuring to hear. I think we all did it, and we all will do it, but it's a bit of an exhausting role, constantly knocking on closed doors.
And
so it's nice.
I mean, it's still difficult. And now I suppose the nuance is not should we use clauses, but you know, organisations understand that contracts are a really important lever to pull in their transition, but now it's ensuring that the drafting is ambitious and robust and reflects their commitments, often commercial, timing, cost and capacity of counterparties to actually commit to some of these, the most ambitious. So we look at that dashboard that you had up, some of those are most ambitious criteria, means that you might get the clause in, but then it's not actually aligned with the Paris Agreement. So that's sometimes where you need to be making trade-offs around meeting parties where they are and making sure there's something in the document, and where you can push a little bit further to make sure that it's aligned with, you know, the science, importantly, and also the targets of the organisation, which we hope are also aligned with the science. But
you know,
never know.
Let me just check the time. Yeah, we got some. So one question I wanted to ask you was, my presentation was quite deliberately quite high level and general and broad, but I thought it might be helpful for the audience to think of a more specific example.
Sure.
And I know you've been working on a project that's to do with the built environment and the implementation of these clauses in that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So through the Chancery Lane project, we received special funding last year from Louders Foundation. That's one of the core funders for TCLP. And with the idea that this stat gets thrown around a lot, but 40% of global emissions is associated with the built environment from energy use of buildings and basically concrete and steel, but the building materials that go into construction. And another fact that I heard the other day is that the only category of waste that continues to go up is construction waste. So commercial waste and household waste is reducing in size year on year, but construction waste continues to increase, which is just wild. So with that in mind, we really wanted to have a targeted intervention for how we can support built environment actors to decarbonise, and that ultimately fell into two main work streams, one being green leasing, which is not a new concept, has been around for quite a while, but trying to sort of shift the dial on green leasing, and ensure that leases are net zero aligned and encouraging 100% renewable electricity and all of that jazz. And then also how we can promote more sustainable construction practices in when things are built. And then, of course, thinking about how those arrangements are financed in particular. And what has been probably not surprising to me, considering I came from the built environment, but is, I think, an interesting reflection on this, is that on the leasing side, organisations have actually been quite progressive because green leasing is a concept that has been around for a while, and also there's a really high demand for green asset, particularly office space in London. 10% of office space is considered the highest green specification, and it makes up 60% of leased asset spaces. So there's a big incentive for landlords to green up their tenancies. For the construction industry, it's a traditionally very risk averse of traditional sector, but also has very, very slim profit margins. And with COVID in particular, these supply chain issues that persist now, and I know like in Australia, in the UK, there's been some really large construction companies that have gone under and just projects being abandoned and all that kind of thing. So it's been quite interesting within the same industry how different the approaches are within sectors, and also how much more difficult it's been to affect change, particularly when there are commercial incentives to do so. So a really good example of that is that the biggest opportunity to reduce emissions in construction projects is in the design, because if you can design out the carbon, design out steel effectively, you're going to reduce emissions more than just changing once the structure is designed, actually by changing the materials that are chosen, or people riding bikes to the side, or reducing waste, or any of that kind of stuff. And if you're reducing the amount of materials in design, you're actually reducing cost of the asset as well. And so it's about having being informed enough to have these conversations. And then while that sounds like a really simple no-brainer, the issue with that is changing the way that things are designed requires parties to step away from what they know, step away from traditional risk allocation, and perhaps step away from the mechanisms in a contract that protect them over time, because they need to try something new, which is, I think, these conversations and the nitty-gritty that we're getting into in the Built Environment Project. We've got an advisory committee of really great organisations, lawyers and corporates coming together to grapple with these issues around how we can overcome these issues together. Is another example of how the nuance of the clauses now is not so much do we use these clauses, but how do we use them. In my Minter Ellison hat on, some of the work that I've been doing with landlords in Australia and also large construction companies is, I think, quite encouraging. I think there's a real will to actually to get these clauses into contracts and to do it in a really robust and meaningful way. And I think that sometimes the sort of reservations around using these clauses is making sure that you're doing things perfectly, particularly for lawyers. That's the way we like things done, but acknowledging that sometimes you have to have a little bit of a halfway house around trying things out, trial and error, and this is the beauty of contracts, is that you can, as Matilda said, literally put anything in it that you want, is to have mechanisms for trial and error, for innovative processes, having forums for parties to come together to discuss climate issues as they arise and actually how to navigate them together, and to think a little bit more laterally about how we can use contracts so they don't just get thrown in the bottom drawer when issues arise. Yeah. It's fun. I love it.
Yeah, that was really helpful, I think, putting it into perspective. Completely changing tack again, my favorite question that I'm excited to ask you is, what's one piece of advice you'd give younger lawyers in the room?
Oh dear, okay. This could be a long elevator ride. I don't know if I can just have one.
Or you can give a couple.
Yeah, so I feel quite lucky to have found my thing in law. And I mean, if I hadn't, I don't think I would still be a lawyer, to be frank. And what I would suggest is that if you haven't found the thing that makes you that you can't stop thinking about, that applies to sort of everything that you do, or even the area that you love and want to learn more about, is I would just make a commitment to being curious and trying to find out what that thing is. I found it out very late in my career. I was already a senior associate for a year or so by the time I found this area. And so would also just say that it's also never too late to change what you're doing, and that every skill, every experience, every bit of work that you do contributes to where you are and where you're going to go. It's I think as well, like if you're in the middle of your training contracts doing rotations, not getting the seat that you want and having to, you know, do something else that you didn't necessarily want to do, all of those experiences build up to getting you to where you are. And even if it's enough to make you realise, I never want to do corporate commercial litigation ever again, thank you very much, which is what I discovered in my second rotation. Very different to you, Matilda. So I think that would be my piece of advice. And there's just so many avenues within the law that I've been able to pave a career in an area that didn't exist 3 years ago. And I think the same will apply to just so many different areas of climate, sustainability, social matters, you know, working on a just transition, all of those really important things. The final thing I'll say, my one piece of advice, is, and I feel quite strongly about this in relation to the climate crisis, is we all, where we are right now and sort of the pathways that we're on, all have a set of skills that contribute to the climate crisis. The best thing I could do was to use the niche skills that I had as a construction lawyer towards the climate crisis. If I just quit law and decided to become a campaigner at a not-for-profit, I'd be upskilling in a whole new area of law, and then there'd be a me-shaped hole at MinterEllison, not fighting the good fight in what should be in corporate and commercial contracts. So I would just think about your unique offering to the climate crisis in terms of what you can provide, and using those skills in that we all need to be climate lawyers, and not just those who are in climate, in climate and sustainability risk teams, but more broadly across all practice areas.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks.
Let's all go forth and be the kooky climate lady in our organisations. So we'll open it up to questions in the room now and online. Online, I think it's probably going to work better if you put your questions in the chat, or you can put your hand up and unmute yourself if you prefer. In both cases, I might read out the questions that are in the chat box, and if you're in the room, I might repeat your question back to you, which is going to sound very off-putting, but it's just in case the microphone didn't pick you up. So yes, we'll start in the back.
Hi, thank you so much, Vivi and Matilda, for your wonderful sharing. I'm Lindsay, one of the founders of Deep Voices, but also currently seconded in a commercial contract law at Sizewell C, which is the most recent nuclear build in the UK. And I had two questions for Phoebe. They're quite geeky and they're quite construction specific. I'm living this in the daily. The first one is on different contractual allocations of risk. Could you give us sort of examples? For example, like I've been exposed to alliance contracting, which is basically differs from the traditional way of contracting, by, you know, you really get parties to work together, project teams are integrated. There's no disputes clause in like a big commercial contract, and it's pain share and gain share. So if the contractors do badly, they often share in the pain, and if they do well, they share the profits. Does that apply to, contracting for climate, and how does it apply? My second question is, how do we change the practice of the construction industry of throwing the contract in the drawer and just never looking at it again?
Yeah.
I work with the supply chain guys, and that's sort of basically what they do.
Yeah, two really easy questions, Mingzi. Thank you. No, the first one on risk allocation methods and just procurement models. Climate is a perfect example of how the current system is broken and it doesn't currently work perfectly for where we need to go. Traditional construction contracts pass risk down as much as possible to the contractor, but what they should do is actually pass risk down to the party who is best placed to manage that risk. When it comes to the climate, it is less about who can manage the risk, but more who can mitigate against the risk, and also sort of who is best placed to advise in relation to that risk. Alliances, collaborative contracting, and all of those sorts of terms really get thrown around as sort of a solution to climate change, whereas I'm of the view that good drafting that can enable the parties to come together and work together is just as effective, and it kind of doesn't matter what label that you give it, but rather that there are mechanisms in the contract, particularly in relation to governance of unforeseeable events, or, how to increase ambition, any of those things, in particular to have clauses. So I think, although it's not a climate example, COVID being a really perfect example, to ensure that parties actually have a mechanism for coming together and talking, and to maintain the relationship when these unknown matters arise. And I think in particular, a good example from the Australian context, we had very severe bushfires on the East Coast at the end of 2019 and 2020, exact moment me having my climate epiphany, just for the timeline of Phoebe's career for everybody. And at that time, I was working on a big hydro project that was significantly disrupted, not because of bushfires, but because of smoke haze that covered the East Coast for 3 months after those bushfires, which was horrific. I was living in Sydney at the time, and you literally couldn't walk from work to the train station. It was really bad. It also made me have a moment for the appreciative high air quality that we have in Australia compared to some other countries. And no contract had articulated the smoke haze. It might have articulated bushfire risk, and it may have articulated inclement weather or latent conditions or something else in the contract. But what about smoke haze? No one had thought about that. And so what is the really important thing here is to be thinking about climate risks in a forward-looking way. We know that the history of, particularly for the physical risks, looks nothing like the future looks nothing like the past. We can't use the past as an analogue for how we predict the future, and we must use the best available science now to look forward. And clearly that contract had looked back because that smoke haze was unprecedented. Same goes for force majeure clauses and unforeseeable acts of God that are no longer unforeseeable just because they're unprecedented. That is the nature of climate, is that these risks are unprecedented. So in terms of, back to your question, Mingzi, I think rather we can be smart about the clauses that we use. We can use it across lots of different models, but rather just to make sure that our contract actually serves us when things come up, rather than it kind of being unfair, for want of a better word. Your second question was, how do we change the construction industry? That is a good question, one that I ponder quite a lot. So you think I'd have a better answer for you right now. I think for all of these issues, I think it all starts with trying to understand the position from the other's point of view in your industry. For those who are procuring projects, and they might want their building to be built. They're the ones employing the employer, as you call them here in the UK, call them the principal in Australia. But for the employer, you know, they want to be able to employ professionals that they can rely on, that are designing them an asset that's resilient for a future that looks nothing like the past. And they want fit for purpose warranties that are going to allow them to ensure that their building withstands physical climate risks, is able to be transitioned to a net zero pathway so they're not left with a stranded asset. And they want that done in a cost-effective manner in the time that they want it built in. For the contractor, they're sitting there saying, that's all fine and good, except this is the first time I'm doing this, so you can't expect me to give you fit for purpose warranties for 25 years, because how can I possibly commit to that when I've never done this before? It's going to cost me a lot of money to design something in a different way than we've designed things before, upskill my staff, provide you with data and information on emissions reporting that you might want through the life of this contract. And so at the moment, we're in this icky transitional period where the parties aren't necessarily able to meet the other's demand, and neither is being particularly unreasonable in that situation. As an owner, I don't know what I'm doing. I want to employ you to tell me what to do, and I want to do that in a competitive environment. And how do I know you're not taking me for a ride? And for the contractor, this is all new. We're trying our best. And, you know, we also have really slim profit margins where if one major thing goes wrong on a project, it can put the whole company at risk. And so what I think is that particularly it's through a kind of a place of understanding and meeting in the middle and acknowledging that this transitional period is going to be icky. Contracts aren't going to perfectly allocate risk. You may have exposures that you would not ordinarily accept, but it's kind of the give and take that we need in order to accelerate the transition. If we wait for everything to be perfect, we'll never get there. And so that's, I think, where we are at the moment. And I kind of, you know, hope the role of, particularly for public infrastructure, governments can sort of lead the way on setting requirements and setting precedent for what should be in project delivery, RFPs and all that kind of jazz. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We'll take one over here and then we'll go to some questions in the chat. So.
Thank you. So from like a disputes perspective, how zealously, in your experience, do parties enforce climate clauses compared to a breach of a more traditional pecuniary loss? And if there is like a discrepancy, how would you say that we should best correct that?
It's a really good question. Oh, do you want to repeat the question?
Oh yeah, thank you. So this was about when it gets to dispute, how rigidly these breach of these sort of clauses enforced.
Yeah.
What we're saying there.
Well done. I thought I'll let you repeat the question. That is a really good question, because that is, like, you touched on one of the core issues with climate clauses, which is what's your remedy for breach in the starting point, and also what's your loss in the event that there is a breach. And so this is where really sort of where we need to think differently about how what those remedies might be, and to use a real corporate saying, to use carrots instead of sticks to incentivize parties to meet these obligations. Matilda had mentioned earlier about the NatWest example, how they'd included termination rights in the event that their suppliers couldn't meet those requirements. Corporations don't want to use termination rights as the stick at all, but rather want to incentivize better performance over time and think about more creative ways to incentivize better performance. So that can look like a sort of pain share, gain share mechanism, like Ming Zi had mentioned, where there's a bonus paid if you're able to meet those requirements, and that can often reflect the savings that the other business would get because they haven't had to pay for offsetting of those emissions to meet their targets. And then likewise, if you're unable to meet the requirements under the clause, that you then need to pay a effective liquidated damages clause, which is a pre-estimate of the loss. Those lucky people who haven't done construction since. A pre-estimate of the loss, and if that can reflect as well the offsetting requirements that for the organisation, because they're now going to have to go and procure offsets to offset the extra emissions that have been emitted because they haven't met those requirements. But that is a live issue, something we were talking about today in the workshop with the nationals, particularly because within their own organisations, these commercial teams are saying, so if they don't meet them, so what? Like, what's actually going to happen? We're not going to terminate them. They're our one supplier for this very important input to our business. So how do we incentivise them? And that often requires sort of decisions from people, sort of executive level decision makers to sort of employ resources to work with and have more of a partnership relationship with their suppliers to school them, upskill them, and to help them with how they might actually go about meeting the obligations, and then to incentivize them to do it in a positive way rather than relying on breach of contract and then litigating, which we all know is not the fun way to go. But a very good question, because it's a real issue.
Yeah, I love that as well, because that's what we like about this, where it's best when it can be the collaborative approach instead of, as we say, knowledge sharing and working together, and not just approaching it from an inherently competitive place from the beginning. I'm going to see what's in the chat. How important are professional bodies? So with architects or engineers, and specifically their PI insurance arrangements.
Very important. I'll keep these short because I'm going over time, but really important. And this is one thing I love about TCLPs. It's not just for lawyers, but it's rather for professionals who work with contracts and clauses, and particularly in the built environment. There are contract managers, leasing managers, who are the ones who are the day-to-day on the front line negotiating and implementing and managing the compliance with the contract. And they're actually the ones who need to know the most about these requirements, other than the lawyers in their ivory tower putting in a precedent document. And particularly for architects, engineers, in the BE, we have talked a little bit about the kind of whole of sector collaboration required for us to get to net zero kind of. And it's a really good example of that. The lawyers can't do it in isolation. I don't know what the Green Star rating says, and that's where I need engineers to help, articulate that for us, where we're the ones who can put it into the contract, make sure that all the other clauses are talking to each other, but it can't be done in isolation. On insurers, that is a really, really important point, particularly PI. So for what the question I think is getting at, is typically the standard of care under the contract, which is that the contractor must deliver the works to the standard of a competent contractor in the shoes of the contractor delivering a project of this type. The PI insurance, the professional indemnity insurance, will typically reflect the standard that's in the contract. So PI insurers dictate what that standard of care is. The thing about climate change and the fact that these risks are changing what is foreseeable and changing the standard of what contractors need to comply with means that when, for example, we want to change the standard of care under the contract to say, contractor, you must actually consider climate risks in a forward-looking way, that requires PR insurers to be on board. So one can't be done without the other. And so, in short, everyone needs to work together. It's the only way forward. Oh, good question.
Oh, you read that faster than me.
Care to really, yeah. Which industries are most open and advanced in terms of climate risks, or does it not depend on industries and rather varies from organisation to organisation? I think it does. I think there are certain industries that obviously are outliers, like the leaders with TCLP, but putting that to the side, the trajectory with climate clauses has very much followed the trajectory of climate ambition for corporates in sectors, basically on who was getting the most attention from activists. So, and I can talk particularly here from our experience at Minters, but, our mining clients in particular, those in extractive industries, were first in the firing line in respect of ratcheting up their ambition and making sure that their you know, that they had targets and that had really fulsome reporting in relation to climate risks. They are the organisations who, because they've already had those obligations in place for a really long time, are now having to think about how they deliver on those obligations. I'd say likewise, financial institutions are following after that, and then it would be the built environment. Then there's organisations like, and the sectors like tech and professional services who are able to be more agile because of the nature of their industry. Things like mining and the built environment is just a bigger ship to steer, even though they're thinking about it more. But yeah, kind of just takes one really passionate person as well within an organisation that can really spearhead how ambitious, because like one thing I've really learned here is the power of like one significantly passionate individual can really spearhead a whole campaign for even the biggest organisation, which is being quite inspirational.
Agreed.
Really.
Which is again a great message for everyone in the room.
Yes.
To go and be that person.
Oh, woohoo.
So if you've got someone working in-house.
Yeah, that's a good question. Best
Tips.
ways to get the entire
Okay,
business on
yeah.
board. Well, congratulations to you. Yes, we are seen as blockers. So I'm having this conversation earlier. So congratulations to you, question asker, on getting people on board with the sustainability requirements. Yes, the lawyers are often seen as the blockers because we're the ones who always raise the issues and the practical issues that seem unreasonable or like they're not going to happen. Actually gets to Ming Z's point around how do we stop contracts being put to the bottom drawer. We will talk about this today actually, in how do you sort of get a whole of organisation approach. And I think, and sort of everyone singing to the same song sheet. And I think there are organisational things that need to be in place to enable to have the enabling settings, and then what are the things that you can do individually in your job. On the organisational side, it's really important that there is, you know, I'm assuming ambitious targets that have been communicated throughout the organisation by senior executives and decision makers and sponsors that articulate the importance of why the organisation is seeking to achieve those goals. And in particular, the risks the organisation if they don't properly implement those goals and how they're going about implementing those goals. And also what would be beautiful at a structural level is ensuring that project teams are actually incentivised to meet these targets and to incorporate as part of their job. Because from the project team's perspective, and again, just getting back into the position of like standing in each other's shoes, sort of if they're not climate people, what's in it for them? Why do I have to do this extra thing that's going to be harder for me to meet my targets, and be harder for me to meet my, my costs are going to go up in my business unit. So what's in it for me adding this extra thing to my to-do list when I've already got a bazillion things, and it's just going to make you look better, sustainability team. Like why should I have to do it? And I think it's again about flipping the conversation from it being a burden to a necessary risk management tool. So, if your business unit is unable to manage or reduce emissions, you'll be paying for the offsetting of the contracts that you're responsible for, or when, the contracts that you've signed will be high emitting contracts that will mean the whole organisation won't be able to meet their net zero commitments. And do you want to be the one left doing that? And how we all need to be, every contract is, enables us to meet our targets. I don't know if I missed anything else. Yes, the other piece of advice I would have, particularly for commercial contract drafting, is to try and have these conversations away from the commercial context of a particular project, because at that point in time, there's time pressures, commercial pressures, you've got the other side. Whereas if you can have these conversations away from a particular project and sort of get everyone aligned as early as possible in the process, that would be my other piece of advice. And to also just get the lawyers, as I'm speaking to the converted here, but to just make sure that you're getting involved as early as possible in the process, because often we get brought in to draft the climate clauses, but they weren't in the heads of terms, they weren't in the earlier documents, and it's just near impossible once all the commercial arrangements have been agreed, because it is a commercial arrangement. So making sure it's framed as one.
Thank you, Phoebe. I think we're already running quite significantly over, so I think we'll do one more question. Is there one in the room? If not, there's one in the chat. Yes, sorry, we'll come to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, wondering how you negotiate in practice supply chain clauses in when your supplier is bigger than you. So for an awful lot of companies, their biggest emissions are going to come from energy,
Yeah.
and their energy supplier is going to be vastly bigger than they are. So how do you work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because a lot of the time, our conversation rightly is focused on how do we support smaller emitters, where this situation is actually something, again, that we talked about today. We had with a particularly ambitious organisation, and this was in the context of a core supplier that was providing like critical IT infrastructure that they just couldn't swap out. So for example, like if they're providing the servers that, you know, hold all the information for Bates Wells, you can't hardly terminate them and try and work with another organisation, which is like a very real commercial issue. And again, I think it's about having the, is about sharing the co-benefits of the arrangement with that counterparty, and also, like we expect large organisations to sort of upskill their smaller SMEs, they might be engaging with. It's the reverse of that situation. The difficulty here is that smaller organisations, like if we're just assuming it's maybe an SME negotiating with a higher power, a larger power, they might not have the resources, not God, praise be, but we've been there, I think, but is understanding sort of what resources that you have at play to sort of bring that commercial arrangement along. It's honestly like I don't have a clear answer for you because it's really hard, and that's where this sort of partnership, a more hand-holding relationship, and about signalling like this is what's important to us. You also have, you know, you're caught by X legislation. This is going to help you to do Y, and starting to kind of shift the conversation in that respect, in that there are mutual co-benefits for both parties in that situation, and it doesn't necessarily have to include more cost. And so in that situation, you can just start by reporting on emissions, and then once you understand what the emissions profile is, doing a you know, an emissions hotspot analysis of where emissions are, you know, where there's potential for those emissions to be released, and then starting to work collaboratively with your counterparties in that way, and trying to take a more staggered approach rather than going really hard and fast with you must do this and include this target right away. Would be my advice, but not an easy one. Good question.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Phoebe, for so much gems and pearls of wisdom there.